The bench by the fountain. The hearing aid was a prop.
Edward Harlan had owned that truth for exactly 11 weeks. Ever since the morning his audiologist, Dr. Renata Osei, had looked at his chart and said, with the measured calm of someone delivering a second opinion no one wanted, that the nerve loss was real, progressive, and hereditary, and that within 18 months the left ear would be, in her word, decorative. He had nodded. He had folded the paper she handed him, placed it in his breast pocket, and driven himself home through the October streets of Charleston, with the radio off and both hands tight on the wheel. He had not told Preston. He had not told anyone. What he had done on a Tuesday afternoon the following week was go to an electronics store on King Street, buy the smallest, most discreet Bluetooth earpiece he could find, and begin an experiment that he could not entirely explain even to himself. He would go out. He would sit in public places. He would switch off every device in his ears, wear the decoy piece, and watch what the world looked like when it believed no one was watching back. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself it was research, the habit of a man who had spent 50 years studying how human beings behaved when they thought they were unobserved. He told himself a lot of things in those weeks, in the long evenings in the house on Trad Street, where Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the side table because he had not been able to move them. What it actually was, he suspected, was a test he was giving himself. A referendum. He wanted to know whether the world, the ordinary, daily, non-transactional world of strangers in a park, was worth the effort of remaining in it. Marion Square was not his usual territory. In the years when Harlan Medtech had occupied the top 3 floors of the building on Broad Street, he had crossed this park twice a day without slowing down, his mind already 3 meetings ahead of his feet. Now he sat on a green-painted bench near the central fountain in a canvas jacket that had cost $40 at a hardware store, his white hair uncombed, his good shoes replaced by the kind of plain leather walking shoes that announced nothing about their owner. He had practiced the face in the bathroom mirror, the mild, slightly vacant expression of someone receiving only the visual channel of the world. Mouth not quite closed. Eyes moving without urgency. It was, he had discovered, remarkably easy to disappear. The Saturday crowd came and went. A woman with a double stroller clipped the edge of his bench without looking up from her phone. 2 college students spread a blanket 30 feet away and played music he could see vibrating from their portable speaker, but could not, with the aids off, actually hear. A man walked a rescue greyhound that paused to study Edward with what seemed like professional sympathy, then was yanked forward. 3 different people sat beside him on the bench, checked their phones, and left. Not one of them looked at his face. He was invisible. He had been invisible for 11 weeks, in 8 different parks and 2 bus stops and 1 McDonald's on Meeting Street, and the cumulative data point of this experiment was one he did not particularly want to sit with. People were not cruel in his experience. They were simply gone. Absorbed so completely into their own frequency that a 74-year-old man alone on a bench did not register as a signal worth receiving. He was background, he was furniture, and he was no longer entirely certain whether that conclusion was an indictment of the world or a fair description of what he had himself become. He was thinking about this, about Margaret, who had never once in 41 years walked past a person sitting alone without at least meeting their eyes, when he heard the footsteps. He did not hear them precisely. With the aids off, the world came to him in a reduced, flattened register. Vibration more than sound, shapes of noise rather than words. But he felt the small thud of sneakers on the pavement path and, a moment later, the familiar pressure shift of someone settling onto the far end of his bench. He did not move. He kept his eyes on the fountain. The new presence was small. He could tell from the weight distribution, from the way the bench barely flexed. A child, young, maybe 8 or 9. He waited for a phone to appear, for earbuds to go in, for the standard modern arrangement of 2 people 3 feet apart in separate universes. Instead, nothing happened for a while. He slid his eyes left, just a degree, in the way he had learned to do without moving his head. The boy was looking at the fountain, dark-skinned, slight, wearing a hoodie that had faded from what had probably once been a bright orange to a kind of dusty rust. His backpack, the cheap, oversized kind that sat wrong on small shoulders, was between his feet. His sneakers had a strip of duct tape across the left toe. He was not on a phone. He did not appear to be doing anything at all. He was just sitting there the way people used to sit before sitting became a performance, and he was looking at the water with an expression that Edward, from a lifetime of reading rooms, identified as the look of someone who did not particularly want to go where they were supposed to be going next. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The boy reached into the front pocket of the backpack and produced a sandwich in a Ziploc bag, the homemade kind, plastic wrap over bread rather than deli paper, the bag reused enough times to be cloudy. He held it on his knees for a moment and looked at it. Then he looked at Edward. Edward arranged his face into its neutral setting and kept his eyes just forward of the boy. The way you looked at someone when you wanted to indicate you were aware of their presence but were not reading anything from it. The standard signal. I'm not a threat. I'm not interested. I am simply here. The boy looked at the fountain again, then back at the sandwich. Then he unzipped the bag, took the sandwich out. It was peanut butter, Edward could tell from the slight ridge where the bread had pressed together, and without any preamble or announcement, broke it in half along an uneven diagonal and held the larger piece out toward Edward. He did not look up when he did this. He just held it out, arm extended, eyes on the fountain, as if this were a thing that required no explanation and no thanks, and was simply the obvious next step when you sat down beside a person who did not appear to have any food. Edward looked at the half sandwich for a long moment. He had been offered things before in his 11 weeks of this experiment. A college student had given him $1. A woman had crouched down and asked, very slowly and loudly, as people do when they know someone cannot hear, as if volume and comprehension were the same thing. Whether he was all right. Sir, do you need help? 2 teenagers had taken a picture of him, which he chose not to think about. No one had broken something they only had one of and handed him the larger half. He took it. The boy nodded once, satisfied, and bit into his own half. They sat there, the 74-year-old man in his anonymous canvas jacket and the 9-year-old boy in his faded orange hoodie, and ate in silence while the fountain did its indifferent thing in front of them and the Saturday crowd moved around them like water around 2 stones. Edward chewed slowly and watched the boy from the corner of his eye. The boy ate without hurry. When a pigeon landed near his feet, he looked at it with mild interest and did not shoo it. When 2 small children ran past shrieking, he watched them with the particular expression of an only child who finds the behavior of multiple children slightly anthropologically interesting. He did not fidget. He did not perform. He was, Edward realized, one of the most naturally quiet human beings he had encountered in a long time, and he was 9 years old. When the sandwich was finished, the boy folded the Ziploc bag with the automatic care of someone who had been taught to take care of small things, and tucked it back in his backpack. He looked at Edward. Edward looked back at him, blankly, pleasantly, the practiced face. The boy reached into the backpack again and produced a small notebook. The composition kind, black and white marbled cover, heavily used, and a stubby pencil. He wrote something, tore the page out with exaggerated care along the spiral edge, and slid it along the bench. Edward picked it up. Hi, I'm Marcus. I figured you can't hear me, so I'm writing. That's okay. My grandpa was deaf too. He said it was peaceful. Edward read it twice. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. The experimental hearing aid was not there, but what was there from long habit was a mechanical pencil, and wrote on the back of the note. Hello, Marcus. Thank you for the sandwich. That was kind of you. I'm Edward. He slid it back. Marcus read it. Then he wrote again. You're welcome. I had enough. What are you looking at? Edward turned to look at the fountain properly, then wrote, the water. It looks like it knows something. Marcus read this. His expression did not change exactly, but something in his eyes shifted. The particular recalibration of a child who has just realized an adult is going to be interesting. He wrote, "Like what? I haven't figured that out yet." Edward wrote, "That's why I keep looking." Marcus looked at the fountain for a long moment. Then he wrote, "I think it just knows it has to keep going, even if nobody's watching." Edward read that twice. He was quiet for a moment. Quiet in the deep way, the way that had nothing to do with his ears and everything to do with the sensation of something shifting in his chest, slow and tectonic, like a door that had been sealed for 3 years, moving on its hinges by a fraction of a degree. He wrote, "How old are you?" 9, almost 10. My mum works in the Harlem building on Broad Street, night shift. I wait for her here sometimes on Saturdays because the library closes early. He read the name of his own building in the boy's handwriting and did not let anything happen to his face. He wrote, "What's your mum's name?" Delia Washington. He stared at those 2 words for longer than he should have. The name arrived in him the way certain things arrive, not loudly, but with the particular weight of something that has been traveling a long distance and has finally landed. Delia Washington. He had not said that name in almost 10 years. He was not sure he had thought it. He had trained himself not to think it, in the way you trained yourself not to press on a bruise, and the discipline had held so well that he had almost convinced himself the bruise was healed. He wrote carefully, "She must work very hard." "She works really hard," Marcus wrote. "She says the building is nice. She says the floors on the top 3 are marble, and she likes the way they sound when she mops them, like the building is breathing." Edward looked at that for a long time. Then he folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up the pencil. He wrote, "It was very good to meet you, Marcus. I'll be here next Saturday if you want to sit again." Marcus read it. He looked at Edward with clear, assessing eyes, the look of a child who has learned early to evaluate adults on actual evidence rather than social convention. And then he nodded, once, in the same satisfied way he'd nodded when Edward took the sandwich. He picked up his backpack. He stood up. He looked at the fountain one more time. Then he walked away without looking back, and Edward sat alone by the water with half a peanut butter sandwich in his stomach and a woman's name folded in his pocket, and the specific, quiet devastation of a man who has just received more grace than he had any right to expect from a Tuesday morning kind of Saturday. He sat on the bench for another 40 minutes after Marcus disappeared into the crowd. The afternoon light had shifted by then, the October sun dropping toward the rooftops on the west side of the square, and the shadow of the fountain stretched longer across the pavement. Edward watched it. He had been watching things, really watching, without the overlay of agenda or the constant internal calculation that had run like background software through every moment of his working life. For only about 3 months, and he was still learning how much there was to see when you stopped trying to use what you saw. Margaret had always known how to look. It was one of the first things he had noticed about her, 44 years ago at a fun dinner in a hotel ballroom in Colombia, where he had been the youngest person in the room and had therefore been assigned to the table closest to the kitchen. She was seated 2 seats away, and she was not watching the speaker. She was watching the waitstaff, the specific, unguarded way they moved when they thought the guests were distracted, the quiet signals they exchanged, the small economies of exhaustion visible in the angle of a wrist. "They work harder than anyone in this room," she had said to him, not as an opinion, but as a simple notation of fact, the way you tell someone what time it was. He had fallen in love with her in that sentence. It had taken him 6 more months to understand that what he loved was not a quality she had, but a capacity. The capacity to look at the world and receive it as it actually was, rather than as it was useful to him for it to be. It was a capacity he had possessed in the early years and lost somewhere in the middle ones, when the company was scaling and every morning brought a new fire, and the cultivation of his own attention had become a luxury he kept meaning to return to. And then Margaret had gotten sick. and then she was gone. And then Preston had said, in the elevator at MUSC Medical Center, with his coat already on and his car keys already in his hand, "I've got a 7 a.m. out of Charlotte, Dad. I'll call you when I land." And Edward had watched his son walk out through the automatic doors and had stood in the elevator for a very long time while the doors kept trying to close and kept sensing him there and opening again, as if even the building wasn't sure what to do with what it was looking at. He had not wept then. He had not wept for a long time afterward. He had gone back up to the room and sat beside his wife and held her hand for the 4 hours it took. And when it was over, he had thanked the nurses by name. He had made sure to learn their names, those women who had been with Margaret every day for 6 weeks while Preston was in New York, managing what he called the portfolio restructuring. And then he had driven home and made himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table until morning. He had told himself in the months that followed that what he felt toward Preston was not grief and not anger, but simply a final, clarifying piece of information. He now knew, with the certainty of empirical data, that his son was a man who left when leaving was convenient and stayed when staying served a purpose. This was not a moral judgment, it was a variable. He would account for it. What he had not accounted for was loneliness. He had thought loneliness was an emotion for people who lacked sufficient interior resources, and he had always prided himself on being self-sufficient in the way that men of his generation prided themselves on that quality without examining what it cost. He had been wrong about that. Loneliness, he had discovered in his 74th year, was not the absence of company. It was the absence of someone who saw you the way you actually were and did not require you to perform a version of yourself that was more convenient. Marcus Washington, age 9, almost 10, had sat beside him for 20 minutes and had given him half a sandwich and had not once required him to be anything other than an old man by a fountain. He took the folded note out of his pocket and read it again. "I think it just knows it has to keep going, even if nobody's watching." He sat with that for a while. Then he stood, slowly. His knees had opinions about benches these days, and put the note back in his pocket and walked toward Broad Street in the long October shadow. His phone showed 3 missed calls from Preston and 1 text. "Dad, the quarterly audit on the foundation accounts is scheduled for the 18th. Wainwright says we need your sign-off before then. Please call." He put the phone back in his pocket without responding. He walked the 6 blocks to Trad Street, let himself in, hung up the canvas jacket on the hook by the door that had been Margaret's hook and had held her coats for 32 years, went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and stood at the window watching the street while the water heated. Then he went to his desk, opened the bottom drawer where he kept the documents he did not discuss with Preston, and placed the folded note on top of a manila folder labelled simply M. He closed the drawer. He poured the tea, he said, to the empty kitchen, to no one, or perhaps to someone. "I'll go back next week." The house did not answer, but he had not entirely expected it to. What silence teaches. He went back the next Saturday and the one after that. By the 4th week, it had become a fact of both their lives without either of them having formally agreed to it. The way certain arrangements solidify not through negotiation, but through the simple, repeated weight of showing up. Marcus always arrived between 11:15 and 11:30, backpack between his feet, composition notebook already out. He had acquired, by the 3rd week, a second pencil, sharper than the first, which he kept in the front pocket of his hoodie specifically for bench conversations. Edward noticed this without remarking on it, the way you notice the small organizational gestures of someone who did not have much, and therefore kept careful track of what they had. Their communication remained paper and pencil throughout October. Marcus had adapted to this with the resourcefulness of a child who spent a great deal of time in libraries and very little time being bored. He began bringing pre-written questions on torn notebook pages so that their exchange could have more momentum. "If you could eat one thing every day for the rest of your life, what would it be?" Edward had written back, "My wife used to make a shrimp and grits that I have not been able to replicate." Marcus had written, I can ask my mum to teach me. Edward had not responded to that one. Do you have any kids? Edward had written, one son. He did not write anything else. Marcus, to his credit, had read the answer, glanced at him once, and moved on. What did you do for work? Edward had written, I made things that helped people hear. A full, considered pause from Marcus, and then, that's kind of funny. Yes, Edward had written. It is, isn't it? By the 5th week, Marcus brought a library book, a thick, dog-eared volume called The Gallaudet Dictionary of American Sign Language, and began teaching Edward signs. This was, Edward recognized, a gesture of extraordinary generosity from a 9-year-old. The boy had checked the book out on his own library card, had apparently watched enough YouTube videos to establish a working vocabulary, and arrived that Saturday with the book open to the introductory chapter and a plan. He would sign something. He would show Edward the corresponding image in the book. He would wait for Edward to mirror it back. If Edward got it wrong, Marcus would shake his head patiently, demonstrate again, and wait. Edward learned thank you, water, yes, no, more, stop, beautiful, where, name, friend. He did not tell the boy that he was filing each session away with the same meticulous attention he had once given to competitive intelligence reports. He did not tell him that in the evenings he practiced the signs in front of the bathroom mirror, not because he needed to learn them, but because having something to practice made the evenings manageable in a way they had not previously been. He did not tell him any of this. He just kept showing up, and Marcus kept showing up. And by the 6th week, the bench by the fountain had developed the specific, unspoken grammar of a place that belongs to two people. It was on the 7th Saturday that the first fault line appeared. Marcus arrived 12 minutes later than usual and sat down with his backpack in his lap rather than at his feet, which was new. His notebook was out, but he had not opened it. He was looking at the fountain with the particular expression Edward had come to recognize as his processing face. The slightly inward look of someone running calculations. Edward waited. After 4 minutes, Marcus opened the notebook and wrote. He slid the page across the bench. Edward picked it up. Devon and Caleb said I should take your wallet. They said you wouldn't know and you wouldn't even be able to say who did it. They said you probably have a lot of money because of your coat. I told them no. I didn't tell them you're actually my friend. Edward read this twice. He kept his face neutral, this was easier than it had once been, and picked up his pencil. What did Devon and Caleb say when you told them no? Marcus read it, wrote. Devon said I was stupid. Caleb said I was scared. I'm not scared of them. I know you're not, Edward wrote. What did you tell your mother about where you go on Saturdays? A pause. A longer pause than usual. Marcus turned the pencil over in his fingers 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And then wrote something, and then crossed it out and wrote something else. I told her I go to the library. Is the library open on Saturdays? A longer pause still. Till noon. She works nights, so she's sleeping when I leave. She doesn't know what time the library closes. Edward looked at that for a while. Then he wrote, So you lied to her. It was not a question. He did not write it as an accusation either. He wrote it the way you stated a variable, flatly, accurately, so that it was on the table between them rather than hidden under it. Marcus stared at the paper. Then he wrote with the slightly defensive pressure of someone who knew they were not going to win this. I didn't want her to worry. She would worry if she knew you were sitting with a stranger every week. She would worry about everything. Then, after a beat, she already worries about everything. Then perhaps, Edward wrote carefully, she should know where you are. Not because I will tell her, but because a person who worries about you deserves accurate information. Marcus read this. He did not look pleased. He looked the way children looked when an adult said something they already knew and had been hoping no one would say. Slightly cornered, slightly sullen, and in the specific way that indicated the statement had landed. He wrote, finally, You sound like her. Edward felt something pull at the corner of his mouth that he controlled before it became visible. He wrote, "I'll take that as a compliment." It kind of was, Marcus wrote. And then, "I'll tell her next week." He did not say whether he would, but he put the notebook away with the decisive gesture of someone who had made a decision and wanted to stop discussing it. And for the rest of that morning, they practiced sign language from the Gallaudet dictionary, and the subject did not come up again. What Edward did not tell Marcus was that he already knew about Delia Washington. Not in a surveillance sense, or at least he told himself not initially. What had happened was simpler and more damning than that. The night after their first meeting, he had gone home and opened the bottom drawer and taken out the manila folder and sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. Delia Washington had been hired by Harlan Building Services, the property management subsidiary, 11 years ago. She had cleaned the top 3 floors, the executive floors, the marble floors, 5 nights a week for 14 months. She had been, by every internal review, a model employee. Thorough, quiet, never missed a shift, never complained, was liked by the overnight security staff. In month 15, Preston, who had been at that point nominally running the subsidiary as part of his gradual onboarding into the company, had reported to HR that several items had gone missing from the executive supply closet on the 21st floor. Printer ink cartridges, a box of pens, a charging cable, the kind of low-value inventory that went missing in any office regularly and was usually attributed to the ambient entropy of shared space. Preston had attributed it to the cleaning staff. He had specifically named Delia Washington. Edward had not been closely involved in day-to-day subsidiary operations by them. He had been managing an acquisition in Atlanta. He had been told there had been a disciplinary issue. The employee in question had been let go per protocol, and that was the end of it. He had not reviewed the evidence. He had not asked for the footage from the supply closet. He had trusted his son's account, as fathers trust, and had moved on. 6 months later, the actual culprit, a part-time admin assistant who had been pilfering and reselling office supplies for 8 months, had been identified during an unrelated audit. The information had been contained internally. Delia Washington had not been contacted. Edward had found this in the audit records 2 years later, during a governance review that had nothing to do with her. He had sat with it for 3 days. Then he had put it in the manila folder and put the folder in the bottom drawer. He told himself he would address it. He told himself many things in those years that he did not do. And now her son sat beside him every Saturday and taught him to sign the word for friend. The calls from Preston were arriving more frequently by November. 3 or 4 times a week, text messages interspersed. The foundation audit, the quarterly reports, a question about the trusteeship structure that Preston framed as procedural, but that Edward recognized from 50 years of reading the subtext of business language as a probe for something larger. Preston was building towards something. He was gathering information about the foundation's governance with the careful, incremental method of someone who already knew what conclusion they were working toward. Edward let the calls go to voicemail. He responded to 3 emails in monosyllables. He called his attorney, a 60-year-old man named Gerald Beaumont, who had been with him for 22 years and who possessed the specific gift of listening to what Edward did not say as carefully as what he did. "I want to update the foundation documents," Edward said. "Broad changes or specific ones?" "Specific, the trusteeship structure, and I want to revisit the testamentary provisions." A pause, brief, professional. "Is this time-sensitive?" "I have 18 months, give or take. Make it somewhat urgent. I'll clear my Thursday." He met Gerald at the office on Thursday. He described in general terms what he wanted. He did not mention Marcus by name. He told Gerald that there were some historic personnel decisions that had not been handled correctly, and that he wanted to include a provision for remedy. Gerald asked no unnecessary questions. This was why Edward had kept him for 22 years. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, Marcus arrived with a piece of paper folded into thirds and presented it to Edward before he even sat down. Edward unfolded it. It was a drawing. marker and coloured pencil, careful and slightly crooked, of two stick figures on a bench, one large and one small, with a fountain behind them drawn as a blue circle with lines radiating out. Above the small stick figure, Marcus. Above the large one, after an apparent revision in which another name had been carefully erased and scribbled over. Edward, my friend. The thing that had been revised, the name that had been erased, was just legible under the marker scribble. It said, The Death Man. Edward looked at the drawing for a long time. He looked at it until he was sure he could look at it without his face doing something he hadn't authorized. Then he folded it carefully along its original lines and put it in his breast pocket, over his heart. He signed to Marcus. Thank you. Marcus, with the slight smugness of a teacher watching a student finally get it right, signed back. You're welcome. 3 days later, Edward received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. He answered it, which he rarely did. Mr. Harlan? Male voice, professional, slightly careful. My name is David Kehoe. I'm a private investigator. I was hired to conduct background research on individuals who have had recent contact with you. I want to be transparent with you about this because I believe you have a right to know. The client is your son. Edward sat down. What specifically is he asking you to research? A woman named Delia Washington and her minor child. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you for calling me directly, Mr. Kehoe. I'll remember that. He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen with the phone on the table in front of him, and the kettle beginning to whistle, and the late November light coming through the window over Margaret's old herb garden, which had gone to seed years ago, but which he could not bring himself to pull out. He thought about a boy with duct tape on his sneaker who had checked out a library book to teach an old man he'd met on a bench how to say the word for friend. He thought about how much he owed that boy's mother, how specific the amount was, how long he had let it sit. He picked up the phone and called Gerald Beaumont. Accelerate the timeline, he said. I want a draft by January. The weight of a secret. January came to Charleston the way it usually did. Not with snow, which the city received perhaps once a decade and treated each time as a minor theological event, but with a grey, penetrating dampness that rose off the harbour and settled into joints and old buildings, and the particular places in the body that held unresolved things. Edward felt it in his knees. He felt it, more precisely, in his left ear, where Dr. Osei's prediction was advancing on its own schedule. The loss was measurable now, week to week. The edges of sounds were softening, the way an old photograph softens in the places where the light was brightest. He had ordered a proper hearing system, digital, adaptive, the best available, which he knew was the best because his company had spent 12 years improving on it, and wore it at home, and switched to the decoy when he went out. He told himself this was still the experiment. He told himself Marcus was still the variable. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. Gerald Beaumont's draft arrived on a Tuesday. Edward read it at the kitchen table with the hearing system in, so that the house sounded full in the way it no longer was. Traffic outside, the refrigerator's hum, a neighbour's dog, all the small sounds that filled the acoustic space where Margaret's voice and footsteps had been, and that he usually preferred not to hear, because the gap between the ambient sound and the silence of the specific sounds that mattered was worse than no sound at all. The document was precise and comprehensive, as Gerald's documents always were. Edward read every page. He made 3 annotations. He called Gerald. The remediation clause, I want it broader, not just the asset provision. I want a formal acknowledgement attached, my signature, that the 2014 personnel action was conducted in error, and that the company record be amended accordingly. Gerald was quiet for a moment. That has implications for the subsidiary's liability exposure. I know. Preston will. I know, Gerald. Another pause. I'll have the revised draft by Friday. Edward hung up and sat for a while. Then he took out the Gallaudet dictionary, which he had bought his own copy of in December, and practiced the signs he'd been taught until his hands stopped shaking. He had not gone looking for the memory of Delia Washington. It had come for him, the way these things came. in the hour before sleep when the mind's administrative systems went offline, and what remained was simply what was true. He remembered her. Not well. He had not, at the time, had occasion to know her well. But he remembered her in the specific way that certain minor characters in one's life achieved permanence, not through significance, but through specificity. She had had a habit, he remembered, of humming while she worked. Not loudly. The kind of humming you heard in the early morning when the floors were empty and sound travelled differently. A low, unbroken thread of something in a minor key. Not quite a song. He had arrived early to the office on several mornings during the year she worked there, and had heard it from the elevator before the doors opened. And he had not thought much about it, except that it made the building feel less like a building. He remembered the morning Preston had come to his office and told him about the supply closet. He remembered the way Preston had presented it, not urgently, not emotionally, but with the careful, deliberate calm of someone who has organized their case in advance. He had said, "We have a problem with one of the cleaning staff. I flagged it with HR. I wanted you to be aware before any action is taken." And Edward had said, "Handle it." 2 words. 20 years of building a company and raising a son had somehow produced a man to whom he could say, "Handle it," and mean, "I trust your judgment over my own attention. I am too busy for the details of this." The 2 words that cost Delia Washington 14 months of verified employment and left her 8 months pregnant and without a reference. He had not known about the pregnancy. He did not learn that until much later, from the audit records that told him less than he needed to know about the human cost of a personnel decision he had delegated to a man who had his own reasons for making it, reasons he was still not entirely certain about. Preston's stated motivation had always been the integrity of the operation. His actual motivation, Edward had spent 3 years trying to be honest with himself about this, may have included something simpler and less flattering. The desire to establish authority in a division that had previously operated without him. The desire to be seen as decisive. The desire to be the kind of manager who was not taken advantage of. These were not evil motivations. They were the ordinary motivations of a young man in his first position of consequence, who had not yet learned that the people most capable of abuse in any system were the ones with enough power to define what abuse looked like. Edward should have taught him that. He had been too busy managing the Atlanta acquisition. He lay in the dark and practiced, "I'm sorry," in sign language, which was a fist rotated twice against the chest, like a small, formal apology the body made to itself. It was a Thursday in February when Marcus Washington finally told his mother where he went on Saturdays. He told Edward about it the following Saturday in his notebook, in the compressed, slightly breathless prose of a child, recounting something that had been more emotionally complicated than expected. "I told her about you. I told her your name is Edward and you're deaf and you're my friend, and I've been going every Saturday for 3 months. She didn't yell, but she got very quiet, which is worse. She said I should have told her. I said I knew. She said, was I sure you were safe? I said yes. She asked me your last name and I said I didn't know." He slid the notebook over. Edward read it. He read the last line again. He wrote, "What did she say then?" "She said she would come meet you next Saturday. Is that okay?" Edward put down the pencil. He looked at the fountain for a moment. Then he picked the pencil up and wrote, "Yes, that's fine." It was not fine in the sense that it would require him to manage a situation that had, until now, been clean in its simplicity. But it was also inevitable. He had known it was inevitable since the afternoon of the first sandwich, when Marcus had written his mother's name in a composition notebook, and Edward had felt the name arrive in him like something that had been in transit for a decade. He wrote one more thing. "You did the right thing, telling her." Marcus read it. Then he signed, unprompted, across the space between them. "I know." That same week, Edward received a call from Preston. He answered it. He was not sure why. Perhaps because he was tired of the particular quality of silence that a dodged call left in a room, the way it lingered there, asking questions. "Dad, Preston's voice had the specific texture of someone who had prepared for a conversation and was now deploying it. I need to talk to you about the foundation's governance structure. Go ahead. I've had Wainwright's team do a preliminary analysis of the trustee arrangement, and there are some redundancies that, frankly, create exposure. If we streamline the board to 2 or 3 trustees rather than 5, the reporting burden drops significantly and we have better oversight. Better oversight for whom? A brief pause. Calibrated, not surprised. Preston did not surprise easily. For the family, for continuity. You're not getting younger, Dad, and the current structure assumes a level of hands-on management that... The current structure is fine, Preston. The auditors flagged. Wainwright's team works for the company, not for the foundation. Send my regards to Wainwright. Silence. Then, in a different register, quieter, more careful, and because of that, more alarming. I heard you've been spending time with someone. A child. In Marion Square. Edward was quiet. David Kehoe is a thorough man, he said, finally. Dad, I'm trying to... Preston! He kept his voice entirely even. I am going to say something once, and I want you to hear it. I know what you're doing. I understand why you're doing it, and it will not change anything. I'm trying to protect you. I know you believe that. He ended the call. He sat for a long time afterward. Then he went to the desk and opened the bottom drawer and added one more document to the manila folder. On the front of the new document, in Gerald Beaumont's careful letterhead, was a title. Second Amendment to the Last Will and Testament of Edward Allen Harlan. Below it, attached with a paperclip, a small velvet box, navy blue, the kind a jewelry store uses. Inside the box, a hearing aid. The latest generation, not the model from his company, a competitor's, because Gerald had asked whether it mattered, and Edward had said no, it's the best one, use that one. He had wrapped a note around the box in his own handwriting, on a card with no printed design, just cream stock. He had written it 3 times before he got it right. I bought this for Margaret. I meant to give it to her before she lost the hearing in her right ear, and I waited too long because I was in Atlanta on an acquisition, and then it was too late. I have kept it for 3 years. I am leaving it to Marcus because he already knows what it's for. It is for listening. Not because your ears work or don't work, but because you decide to. E.H. He put the card back in the box. He put the box back in the drawer. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in months. Delia Washington came on the last Saturday of February, and she was nothing like what Edward had been managing himself to be ready for, which was fair because he was not sure what he had been ready for. She was 41. She was tired in the way that the kind of tired that goes deeper than sleep could reach always showed. Not sloppily, but in the particular economy of movement of someone who had learned to spend energy carefully. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for February, but was clean and pressed, and she had Marcus's same quality of stillness, which told Edward that the quality came from her rather than from him. She did not sit down immediately. She stood a few feet from the bench, and she looked at Edward with the specific, appraising look of a woman who has spent many years being underestimated and has developed, as a survival tool, the ability to take very accurate readings from very small signals. He watched her read him. He had worn the decoy hearing aid. He had not decided until this morning whether he would tell her the truth. He had decided, standing at the bathroom mirror, that he would not. Not yet. Not today. He needed to know one more thing before he did. She sat. Marcus sat between them. She produced a notepad from her purse, an actual stenographer's pad, which surprised him, and wrote, "Marcus says you've been kind to him. Thank you." Edward wrote back, "He has been kind to me." She read that. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her face. Not softening exactly, but a small removal of wariness, the way a door opens a fraction when the person behind it recognizes a voice they hadn't expected to recognize. They sat together for 40 minutes. Marcus, between them, served as a kind of translator, not of language but of register. When Delia wrote something careful, he would read it and add an annotation in his own cramped handwriting below. She means she was worried, but she's not anymore. When Edward wrote something formal, Marcus would glance at it and then at his mother and sign something that Edward now recognized as, he's being polite. He actually thinks it's funny. At the end of the visit, Delia stood and gathered her notepad. She looked at Edward one more time with that careful, reading look. Then she wrote one final thing and held it out to him without putting it on the bench. He took it. He hasn't had many people. He's fine, but he hasn't had many. Thank you for being one. He folded the paper. He put it in his breast pocket, next to the old drawing of 2 stick figures and a fountain. He signed to Marcus, same time next week. Marcus grinned, the full, unguarded grin of a child who has just had 2 separate important things confirmed at the same time, and signed back. Same time. Delia watched this. Her face did something that Edward thought might be the closest she allowed herself to relief. She said nothing. She had not said anything aloud this entire morning, and Edward understood why. Sound was not her first language of trust. She gave it carefully, or not at all. He understood that now more than he would have 3 months ago. He watched them walk away, Marcus pulling slightly ahead, Delia's hand moving to his shoulder with the automatic, spacious gesture of a mother who has learned to hold on without holding back. And he sat by the fountain until the cold finally made him move. On the bus home, a woman across the aisle smiled at him. He was so startled that he smiled back before he could stop himself. She looked surprised and then pleased, and then looked back out her window. He thought about that for the rest of the ride home. The scholarship appeared in Marcus's school account in March, attributed to the Harlan Education Access Fund, a small, specific sub-vehicle of the foundation that Gerald had set up at Edward's direction, and that existed at that point for exactly 1 beneficiary. The first disbursement covered the cost of a blazer, 2 pairs of trousers, shoes, the technology fee, and the spring field trip to Washington, D.C. Marcus's note, delivered via composition notebook the following Saturday, read, "Mum cried. She doesn't know who did it. I think I might know. Are you going to tell me?" Edward wrote, "Does it matter?" Marcus looked at the fountain, then he wrote, "No, but I want to say thank you to the right person." Edward looked at that. Then he signed, slowly and carefully, the gesture he had practiced, both hands open, pressed briefly to his chest, and then extended outward, the palms up. It was not an official sign. It was something he'd made up. But Marcus looked at it and, after a moment, appeared to understand. He made the same gesture back, mirroring it. Neither of them wrote anything after that. The will and the truth. The April morning that Edward Harlan's heart decided it had been patient enough arrived on a Tuesday while he was standing in the kitchen making tea. It was not dramatic in the way that the body's rebellions are rarely as dramatic as the mind imagines them in advance. He felt a tightness, and then a heaviness, and then he was on the floor with his left cheek against the cold tile, and the kettle screaming on the stove. And the thought that crossed his mind, clear and brief as a headline, was, "Gerald has the documents. It's fine." He reached for the phone on the floor beside him, which had fallen when he fell, and called 911 with hands that felt thick and distant, and gave the address in a voice that worked, which he was grateful for, and then lay there until he heard the sirens. MUSC Medical Center. The same hospital, the same white corridors, the same specific smell that was not, he thought, in the ceiling tiles or the cleaning solution, but in the sound of the place. The particular acoustic signature of controlled emergency, the language of monitors and intercoms, the footsteps of people who knew exactly where they were going and could not stop. He had been here when Margaret died. He had been in a different wing, the oncology floor, the quieter section, the section that had learned over years to manage both urgency and stillness. He had left through the same automatic doors Preston had walked out of, in the wrong direction, toward the parking garage rather than back up to the floor. He lay in the bed in the cardiac unit on the 3rd floor and stared at the ceiling and thought about direction. He was feeling better than he should, he suspected, which was either a good sign or the particular clarity that arrived before things got worse. Gerald arrived within 2 hours, which told Edward that Gerald had been expecting a call like this and had kept his schedule accordingly. He came in with a briefcase and the expression of a man who was not surprised and was not going to waste time performing surprise. "The documents," Edward said. "Complete, signed, filed as of last week. All provisions valid and executable. The hearing aid box is in the bottom drawer, left side of the desk. The folder is labelled M. I know where it is." "If I don't, Edward. If I don't, Gerald." Gerald sat down. He put his briefcase on the floor. He looked at Edward with the expression of a man who has spent 22 years watching someone be right about nearly everything and was not going to argue about death. "I know where everything is," he said. "Everything is in order. Marcus is at Whitmore Academy. He'll have school on Tuesday. Someone should make sure Delia knows before he hears from someone else." Gerald nodded. "And Preston? I'll handle Preston. He'll fight it. He'll try." Gerald's voice was entirely calm. "He will not succeed." Edward nodded. He looked at the ceiling for a while. "I want to see the boy," he said. Gerald looked at him. "Not today, perhaps, but if I'm here more than a day, I'll reach out to his mother," Gerald said. Edward did not die that week. He came close enough to constitute a meaningful draft. A 70% blockage in the LAD artery, a stent placed on Wednesday morning, a recovery that the cardiologist described as better than we had any right to expect from a man your age, who has been under sustained stress and probably hasn't slept properly in 3 years. He did not dispute the characterization. Preston arrived on Thursday. He came in a charcoal blazer that must have been purchased for travel, the kind that did not wrinkle. His hair was perfect. He smelled like airport coffee and something expensive. He stood in the doorway of Edward's hospital room for a moment, before crossing to the chair beside the bed, and in that moment, with the institutional light falling across his face and the monitor beeping at its steady, uninflected pace, Edward saw his son with the particular clarity that hospitals sometimes imposed, clearly, without the overlay of history or want or the specific occlusion of love. Preston was 51 years old. He was his father's jaw and his mother's colouring, and he had his mother's hands, which was the detail that had always made Edward most unable to be simply and cleanly angry with him. He was not, Edward thought, a bad man. He was a man who had decided, somewhere in his middle 30s, that protecting what he called the legacy was a moral position rather than a self-interested one, and who had organised his entire ethics around that premise so thoroughly that he could no longer see the organising principle beneath it. "Dad," Preston sat. "How are you feeling?" "Better. They said the stent went well." "It did." Silence. Preston looked at the monitor, then at the window, then at his hands. "I should have come sooner," he said. "When you stopped returning my calls." "Yes," Edward said. "You should have." Preston looked at him. He seemed to be deciding whether this was an opening or a rebuke. He decided, incorrectly, that it was an opening. "While you're here, while we have some time, I think we should talk about the foundation structure. Wainwright has some concerns about the trustee, Preston. The governance issue is real, Dad. It's not something I'm manufacturing." "Your son died," Edward said. Preston stopped. "Not literally, but whatever you might have been, when you were 12 and you used to come to the office on Saturdays and sit at the drafting table and draw buildings. Whatever that was, I seem to have misplaced it. And I've spent 3 years trying to figure out whether I lost it or whether I failed to cultivate it. I haven't reached a conclusion." Preston was very still. He had his mother's stillness too when something landed. "I'm not angry at you," Edward said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not. But I need you to understand that some things have been decided. Gerald will walk you through them. I'd like you to listen rather than respond, for the first part of that conversation. Can you do that? Preston's jaw moved once. What things? Decisions about the estate, about the foundation, about some historic wrongs that should have been addressed years ago and weren't, because I trusted your account over my own attention. And that was my failure, not yours. What historic wrongs? Gerald will walk you through it. Dad, there's a woman named Delia Washington, Edward said. Her son is the most honest person I know. He is 10 years old and he will, if given any resources at all, do something remarkable with his life. She was unjustly terminated from this company in 2014 on information that was, at minimum, unverified, and that termination cost her significantly. The estate will make that right. That's not a negotiation, that's a statement. Preston stared at him. You've been meeting with them, he said, and his voice had gone to a place that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was somewhere between them, in the country of a child who has discovered that the story they told themselves about their parent was not the only story. For how long? 6 months. The detective said, yes, I know about the detective. The monitor kept its pace. Something in the hallway beeped twice and went quiet. You hired someone to investigate a 9-year-old child, Edward said. Preston, you hired someone to investigate a 9-year-old child. Preston said nothing. He was looking at his hands. He looked, for a moment, genuinely young. Not in a soft way, but in the way that people looked young when the face they'd learned to show the world slipped, and what was underneath it was just someone who had not sorted everything out the way they'd thought they had. I was trying to protect you, he said. I know, Edward said. You need to understand that protection can be a kind of control. Your grandmother understood that. Your mother understood it. I understand it now. I should have taught it to you earlier. Preston did not respond. Go home, Edward said. Come back on Sunday. I'll be in better shape by then, and we can have a proper conversation. But speak to Gerald first. Marcus arrived on Friday afternoon. He had come, as Edward had suspected he might, on his own initiative. Not because Delia had sent him, but because the building's weekend security guard, an older man named Carl, who had watched Marcus grow up in the lobby while his mother worked the floor above, had called Delia when the news hit the local business page, and Delia had said nothing to Marcus, but had come home from the pharmacy with an extra snack pack in the grocery bag, which was how Marcus knew something was wrong, and Marcus had drawn his conclusions from there. He was wearing his school blazer over his regular clothes, which suggested he had come directly from school, which suggested he had left somewhat earlier than his schedule permitted. He stood in the doorway. He was carrying his backpack and the composition notebook. Edward was sitting up in the bed. He had his proper hearing system in, the full digital one, not the decoy, because the decoy had been in the kitchen when he fell and he had not replaced it, and he had not, in the ICU, had any particular desire to perform anything for anyone. He watched Marcus take in the room. The monitor, the IV line, the specific indignity of a hospital gown, against which Edward had lodged an internal protest, but was outvoted by the nursing staff. Marcus walked to the chair beside the bed. He sat down. He opened the composition notebook, but he didn't write anything yet. He looked at Edward. Edward looked back. And then, because the notebook was open between them and the pencil was in Marcus's hand, but neither of them had moved, Edward did the thing he had been moving toward for 6 months without entirely admitting it to himself. He reached up and took out his hearing aid, not the decoy, the real one. He held it in his palm and looked at it, and then he looked at Marcus and he said, in his own voice, the voice he had not used with this boy in 6 months of Saturday mornings and notebook pages, I heard everything you ever said to me. Marcus went very still. I'm not deaf, Edward said. I was never fully deaf. My hearing is declining. Genuinely, that part is real. But I was never the man who couldn't hear you. I heard every word. Every Saturday. Marcus stared at him. His expression moved through several rooms very quickly. Confusion, recalibration, something that was the beginning of anger, then something that was the beginning of something more complicated than anger. He looked down at the notebook. He looked up. He picked up the pencil and put it down again. Then he signed. Not one of the signs Edward had been taught, but one he'd clearly learned separately from somewhere else, because it was more advanced. Both hands flat, crossed at the wrists, then pulled apart. The universal sign for why. Because, Edward said, I needed to know if the world was still worth being in, and I didn't trust my own answer. I needed to see what someone who didn't know who I was would do. Marcus processed this. And you gave me your sandwich, Edward said, the larger half. The boy looked at him for a long time. A specific kind of 10-year-old thinking was happening, the kind that adults often underestimated because it was quiet, but that was in fact more rigorous than most adult thinking, precisely because children had not yet learned to short-circuit the process with conclusions that were convenient. I would have done that anyway, Marcus said, finally, even if you could hear. I know, Edward said. That was the point. Another silence. Then Marcus picked up the pencil and wrote something and pushed the notebook across the blanket. Are you going to die? Edward looked at it. Not today, he said. Probably not soon, but eventually, yes. That's a fact about everyone. Marcus took the notebook back, wrote something else. My mum is going to want to know if you're okay. Tell her I'm better. Tell her Gerald Beaumont will be in touch. Marcus looked at the name. Something crossed his face. A recognition or the beginning of one. Marcus, Edward said. There are some things I need to tell your mother that should have been told a long time ago. Gerald will tell her. It's his job to do it properly, legally. But I want you to know, before anyone tells you anything, that what I did on that bench every Saturday was real. The conversations were real. What I feel for you and your mother is real. Whatever else comes, and some of it may be confusing, I want that to be the first thing. Marcus read his face with those clear, careful eyes. Then he nodded. The same single nod, the one that had meant, I accept this, since the first Saturday, since the first half of a sandwich, since the beginning. He stood up. He put the notebook in his backpack. He looked at Edward one more time. He signed, See you next week. Edward signed back, See you next week. Marcus walked out. At the door, he turned once, not a backward glance exactly, but a marking of the room, the way you marked a place you intended to return to. And then he was gone, and Edward lay in the hospital bed with his real hearing aid on the blanket beside him, and the monitor keeping its patient count, and the distant hospital sounds coming through the wall, and he thought, See you next week. That was enough. That was, for now, enough. The call from Preston came 4 hours later. He had spoken to Gerald. His voice was different now, not the controlled, prepared voice of their previous conversation, but something rawer and less organized. The voice of a man who has received information he could not immediately file anywhere useful. You're giving her 60% of the Foundation's investment authority, Preston said. A woman who cleaned our floors. A woman who cleaned our floors very well for 14 months before we fired her without cause. Dad, I didn't fire her. You did. And then you didn't tell me the supply closet footage showed nothing. A very long silence. I was 29, Preston said. Yes, Edward said, you were. And I was 54, and I should have been paying attention, and I wasn't. We both owe her something, Preston. I'm making sure one of us pays it. I'll contest the will. Gerald expected you might, Edward said. He'll share his expectations about the outcome. He ended the call. He lay in the dark. From down the hall, the sound of something, a television, a monitor, a voice, came through the wall, muffled and indistinct, the way sounds arrived in a body that was learning to lose them. He lay there and listened anyway, with the full, deliberate attention of a man who had spent 6 months learning what it meant to actually hear something. It was, he thought, not so different from signing. From the moment Marcus had first opened the Gallaudet dictionary on a November Saturday and shown him the picture of 2 hands making the shape of friend, it was not so different. You couldn't do it passively. You had to choose it. You had to turn toward it. You had to decide again and again that the signal was worth receiving. He closed his eyes.
Down the hall, someone laughed. The sound travelled through 2 walls and a corridor and arrived at him diminished and warm, like light through a curtain. And he thought, still worth it. Outside, the spring pressed against the window in the dark. Inside, the monitors kept count. And in a small apartment on the east side of the city, a boy was probably telling his mother that the old man was going to be fine. And his mother was probably standing in the kitchen being quietly relieved. And somewhere in the bottom drawer of a desk on Trad Street, a navy blue velvet box sat in the dark. And inside it, a hearing aid waited, patient as a letter that already knew where it was going. What the deaf man heard the hearing. The courtroom on Broad Street was the kind of room that had been designed at some historical point to produce a specific psychological effect. The elevated bench, the panelled walls, the particular quality of fluorescent light bouncing off surfaces that had absorbed the weight of a great many consequential moments. It had the effect, on most people, of making them feel that what happened here mattered in ways that extended beyond the individual parties. Delia Washington, sitting at the plaintiff's table in the civil proceeding brought by Preston Harlan to contest the validity of the Edward Harlan estate documents, did not appear to find the room impressive. She appeared to find it, if anything, slightly tedious, in the manner of someone who had been told a great many times by a great many rooms that they did not belong there, and had long since stopped letting rooms have that opinion about her. She was wearing a grey blazer she had borrowed from her supervisor, Mrs. Fontenot, and she had Marcus's composition notebook in her bag, which she had not taken out and did not intend to. She had read it, though, all of it. She had spent 2 evenings going back through every notebook from the past year, reading her son's account of his Saturday mornings with the old man who couldn't hear, and she had felt many things in that reading, gratitude and sadness, and the complicated, not entirely comfortable feeling of being seen at a distance by someone you hadn't given permission to look. But that had been in February, when Gerald Beaumont had come to their apartment and sat at their kitchen table and explained, methodically and without theatrical pause, the contents of the estate documents, the remediation clause, and the formal acknowledgement regarding her 2014 termination. She had listened to the entire thing without interrupting. At the end, she had asked 2 questions. The first was, is the acknowledgement legally binding? It was. The second was, what does Marcus know? Gerald had looked at her and said, he knows his friend wanted to make things right. He may need time to understand what that means. She had nodded. She had made tea. Gerald Beaumont had declined the tea very politely, which told her he had been taught manners by someone who meant it. That had been in April. It was now October, 18 months after Marcus's first Saturday in Marion Square, and she was sitting in a courtroom on Broad Street while Preston Harlan's attorneys made their case. The case, as she understood it from Gerald's preparation sessions, was threefold. That Edward Harlan had been in a diminished mental state when the will was executed, that he had been unduly influenced by parties with a financial interest in the outcome, and that the remediation clause was legally defective because it had been drafted without adequate disclosure to the estate's primary stakeholder, meaning Preston, who had a legitimate claim as the surviving family member. Gerald had described this case as ambitious in its creativity and limited in its foundation. He had said this the way he said most things, without inflection, which made it more comforting than if he had said it enthusiastically. Preston was present in the room. He sat at the respondent's table. It was his case, technically, he was the plaintiff, in a suit that cost more than Marcus's first semester of school. He had not looked at Delia when she came in. He had not looked at Marcus, who was not present, because Gerald had advised strongly against it and Delia had agreed, though Marcus had argued, in his notebook, that he was old enough to sit in a room while adults argued about him. She had told him she knew that, and that was exactly why he wasn't going. Preston's lead attorney, a man named Calder,
who had practiced for 30 years and had the measured authority of someone who charged $400 an hour for the authority, opened the case with the argument about mental state. He produced correspondence. He produced a psychiatric evaluation that had been prepared. Gerald informed the court flatly, without the subject's participation or consent. He produced character witnesses who described Edward Harlan as increasingly erratic and prone to unusual behavior in his final years. Gerald did not object to most of this. He let it settle in the room. He waited. Then he stood up and said, quietly, "Your Honor, the plaintiff has described an elderly man who went to a park, who taught himself sign language, who maintained, over a period of 18 months, a relationship of extraordinary consistency and intentionality with a child and that child's mother. The plaintiff calls this erratic. I would like to present the record of Mr. Harlan's communications during this period, his correspondence with me, his medical records from MUSC showing full cognitive function at the time of document execution, and the testimony of Dr. Renata Osei, his audiologist, who will speak to the diagnosis that prompted this entire chapter of his life." Calder Dare objected to the framing. The judge overruled the objection. Dr. Osei was clear, systematic, and entirely impossible to rattle. The diagnosis, progressive sensory neural hearing loss, hereditary, confirmed. The timeline. Edward Harlan had received his diagnosis and chosen, in response, to spend time in public places without his hearing devices, observing the world on different terms. The cognitive function at the time of the estate amendment, entirely within normal parameters for a man of his age and health history. In fact, she added, in the flat, conclusive way of someone who has answered this particular flavor of question before. His recall during our appointments was consistently better than many patients 20 years his junior. Calder moved on to undue influence. He submitted photographs, the ones taken by David Kehoe, the private investigator, of Edward and Marcus in Marion Square. He submitted records of the scholarship payments from the Harlan Education Access Fund. He submitted Gerald Beaumont's fee invoices, suggesting that the rapidity of the estate amendment indicated external pressure. Gerald allowed all of this to be entered. Then he said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff is arguing that a man who gave a sandwich to an elderly stranger in a public park exerted undue influence on that elderly stranger. I would like to invite the court to consider what that argument says about the plaintiff's understanding of what undue influence means, and what it says about his understanding of his father." Calder objected. The judge let it stand. Then Gerald put Delia on the stand. She had not wanted to take the stand. She had told Gerald this in their kitchen, at the table where she had made tea he didn't drink, and Gerald had said, "You don't have to say anything complicated. You just have to be present. Let them look at you." She understood what he meant by that, and she did not entirely like being a strategy. But she also understood that certain situations required you to be a strategy whether you liked it or not. You showed up. You let the room look at you. You did not perform, because performance was detectable, and she had never been a particularly good performer. Calder cross-examined her about the scholarship, about when she had first been told about the estate, about whether she had encouraged Marcus to spend time with Edward Harlan. She answered everything in the same even, unhurried voice she used when she explained things to Marcus. Not because she was managing herself, but because she had been explaining things to people who did not expect her to be articulate for 41 years, and had found that calm was, in the long run, the most disorienting thing you could present to someone who expected emotion. She answered the last question. "Did you at any point direct your son to cultivate a relationship with this elderly man for financial purposes?" By looking at Calder for a moment before she spoke, with the expression of someone checking to make sure they had heard the question correctly. "No," she said. "Marcus brought home a drawing of 2 stick figures on a bench and told me he'd made a friend. That's all." She reached into her bag and put the drawing on the witness stand. She'd had it in a plastic sleeve. It had been in Marcus's notebook, and she'd asked him if she could keep it, and he'd torn it out and given it to her with the slight formality of a child who understood that some things required ceremony. The judge looked at the drawing. Calder looked at it. The room looked at it. It was, objectively, the drawing of two stick figures on a bench. One large, one small. The fountain was a blue circle. Above the large figure, in a 10-year-old's handwriting, Edward, my friend. Calder did not ask any more questions about that particular exhibit. After the session, not the final ruling, which would come 3 weeks later and would go entirely against Preston, but after the morning session, when the court broke for lunch and people began to move around the room again with the slightly dazed quality of people recalibrating after a sustained effort, Preston crossed to where Delia was standing near the door. She saw him coming. She did not move toward him or away from him. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. He looked at her the way his father had looked at her that first Saturday in February. Not with hostility exactly, but with the expression of someone reorganizing a picture they thought they had finished. He was the same with me, Preston said. When I was young, he made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She looked at him. I know it doesn't fix anything, he said. I know what I did in 2014. I didn't know about Marcus then. I'm not sure what difference that makes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, It doesn't make a difference about what happened to me, but it might make a difference about what happens to you. He looked at her. He loved you, she said. Your father. I could tell that from reading his letters. He didn't know how to be what you needed, and you didn't know how to be what he needed. And that's a tragedy, but it's not a moral failing on either side. It's just what happened. She paused. My son lost his friend. That's what I'm dealing with. That's what I'm going to keep dealing with. If you want to have a separate relationship with that grief, that's your business. But don't tell him he was just someone's prop. That's the one thing I'll ask you not to do. Preston was still for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and it was Marcus's nod, she noticed, the same single downward motion of acknowledgement that had no performance in it. He walked away. She watched him go. Gerald appeared at her elbow. The afternoon session will be shorter, he said. We should eat something. She picked up her bag. She picked up the drawing in its plastic sleeve and put it back. Yes, she said. Let's eat something. The box. For 3 months after the will was filed and the legal proceeding resolved, and the paperwork that Gerald called the remediation was completed and signed and made part of the public record at Delia's insistence, for 3 months, Marcus did not go to the house on Trad Street. He was not forbidden from it. Delia had not said anything about it one way or another, which was her method. She named the thing that mattered and left the rest to him. What she had named was this: the house is part of the estate, and you have a right to be there, and whenever you're ready to go, we'll go together. She had said this once and not repeated it. Marcus had said nothing. He had gone to school, he had come home, he had eaten the food she made and done the homework she checked, and slept in the room he had slept in since he was born, with the drawing on his desk. She had given it back to him after the trial, and the composition notebook from the last year's Saturdays. The velvet box sat on the corner of his desk. Gerald had brought it in September, when the estate documents were finalised. He had put it on the kitchen table and told Marcus it was from Edward, that it had been specifically designated and that there was a letter inside. Then he had excused himself to the living room, in a gesture of tact that Marcus understood was not about giving him privacy, but about not making him perform receiving something important with an audience. Marcus had sat at the kitchen table and opened the box and read the card 3 times. Then he had closed the box and gone to his room and not come out for 2 hours. Delia had knocked once at the 1-hour mark and said through the door, "There's food when you want it." She had not asked anything. She had understood from 21 years of living in a world that did not always arrange itself well, that there were certain kinds of information that required time to settle before you could think about them clearly, and that the worst thing you could do to someone processing that kind of information was to ask them how they were processing it. What Marcus was processing was not simple. He was processing. The old man had been watching him, not in a dangerous way, he understood, with the straightforward instinct of a child who had been taught by his mother to trust his instincts, that Edward Harlan had never been anything other than exactly what he appeared to be on the bench. But he had been watching. He had turned up that first Saturday not accidentally but on a schedule, in a place where he might encounter Delia Washington's son, because he had wanted to see who the boy was. That was the piece Marcus kept turning over, the part that felt, depending on the day and the hour and how tired he was, either like the most loving thing an adult had ever done, to go looking for the person they owed, and to find them and to decide that what they owed was time and presence rather than money. Or like a kind of trespass, a documentation of his life that he hadn't consented to, an observation conducted without full disclosure. He understood, he thought, why Edward had not told him. He understood it the way he understood most things about adults, not because adults had explained it to him, but because he had spent 10 years watching the gap between what adults said and what they actually did, and learning to read the gap. Edward had needed to see him first. He had needed to establish, before disclosure changed everything, whether what was between them was real, whether it would survive the truth. And then he had told him, in the hospital, with his real hearing aid in his hand, held out like evidence. Marcus picked up the velvet box and turned it over. The hearing aid inside was small and white, newer than any he had seen on Edward. It had a small note taped to the lid that said, in Gerald's formal handwriting, "For Marcus Washington, to be worn or carried as he chooses." He put it back on the desk. He went to the kitchen. His mother was at the table with the bills and a cup of tea. He said, "Mum." She looked up. He brought sandwiches too, sometimes. Starting in December, he always brought too many. She waited. I think he was practicing how to give things to people the right way. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You think he figured it out?" Marcus thought about it. "I think he was getting there," he said. She nodded. "Can we go to the house on Saturday?" he said. "Yes," she said. "We can go on Saturday." He went back to his room. He picked up the velvet box and opened it one more time and looked at the hearing aid. It was good technology. He knew enough, from the months of conversation about what Edward's company had made and why, to recognize good technology. It was curved and small and designed to disappear behind the ear, to be worn without announcement. He thought about what the card had said. It is for listening, not because your ears work or don't work, but because you decide to. He put it back in the box. He did not close the lid. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at it for a while, the way Edward had taught him to look at things, without agenda, without trying to use what he saw, just receiving it as it was. He thought about the fountain, about the water that kept going, about a Saturday in October when a man in a canvas jacket had been sitting alone on a bench, and he had had a sandwich and nowhere else to be, and had made, without thinking about it, the only decision that had made sense to him, which was to sit down and not make the man eat alone. He had not done it because he knew who the man was. He had done it because the man was there, and he had enough, and the math was obvious. The math was still obvious, he thought. Maybe that's the whole thing. Maybe that's what Edward had been trying to work out, all those Saturdays with his hearing aid off, and his notebook open, and his eyes on the fountain. Whether the math was still obvious in the world. Whether there were still people for whom the equation of "you have enough, share it" was native rather than performed. There were. Marcus was one of them, and Edward had needed to know that, had needed to have one data point he could hold, because the other data points in his life, Preston, the Atlanta acquisition, the months he hadn't been watching, had given him different results. He had found what he was looking for. Marcus picked up the hearing aid and put it in his palm. It was lighter than he expected. He thought, "You found it, old man." Then, because he was 10 and because the October light was coming through the window at the angle that always made him think of the park, he said it out loud, to the room, to no one, or to someone. "You found it." The room, as expected, did not answer, but the light stayed. The talk. The following April, When the trees on Trad Street were doing what they did every year without being asked, simply because it was time, Marcus stood at the front of the classroom at Whitmore Academy and gave the presentation that was required of every sixth grade student in the spring semester. The assignment was called The Person Who Changed Your Direction. The teacher, Mr. Okonkwo, had given the instructions on a Tuesday in February, and the class had spent 2 months preparing. And in that time, Marcus had seen 3 different drafts of his presentation, 2 outlines that he'd written and crossed out, and a full start in which he tried to write about his mother, and had gotten 3 pages in before realizing that what he was writing was not going to fit in 8 minutes, and was not, in any case, what the assignment was asking for. It was asking for direction. His mother had not changed his direction. His mother was his direction. Those were 2 different things. He had started over. He had written the true version in 2 sittings, on a Saturday afternoon in the house on Trad Street. They had been there every Saturday since October, tending the garden that had gone to seed and that was, now, a project. And he had printed it out and read it once more and decided it was right. The classroom at Whitmore Academy was nicer than any room he had been in before Whitmore, in the matter-of-fact way that well-funded schools were nicer, which he had stopped noticing after the first month. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle and the projector worked, and there was a window with actual curtains. His classmates were the kind of kids who had been to other countries and had strong opinions about things he hadn't encountered yet, and he had learned from them and found them interesting, and had not once wished he was somewhere else, which surprised him when he thought about it, because he had expected to. Delia was in the back row. She was in the right chair, 3rd from the left on the outside aisle, where he had told her to sit, because that was the chair with the best sightline to the front. She was wearing the grey blazer from the trial, which had become, since then, her blazer. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her face in its default configuration, present, composed, taking everything in without advertising what she was finding. On his neck, on a cord he'd made from kitchen twine the previous Saturday in the house on Trad Street, Marcus wore the hearing aid from the navy blue velvet box. He had not been sure until the morning of the presentation whether he would wear it or carry it. He had put it on and looked in the bathroom mirror, not at the hearing aid specifically, just at himself, at the version of himself that was wearing it, and had decided that wearing it was right. Not because he needed it to hear, but because some things you carried in the open, so they didn't become the kind of secret that got heavy. He walked to the front of the room. He looked at his classmates. He looked at Mr. Okonkwo. He looked at his mother in the 3rd chair from the left, who nodded once, the way she always nodded at the beginning of something. He said, "The person who changed my direction sat on a bench in Marion Square and didn't say anything to me for the first 3 hours I knew him." He heard a few of his classmates shift in their chairs, the particular shift of people who had expected a standard opening and received something else. He said, "His name was Edward. He was 74 years old, and he had a lot of money, and he came to the park every Saturday in a cheap jacket so people wouldn't know who he was. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know anything about him, except that he was alone and I had a sandwich." He paused. He told me later that he was testing something, trying to figure out if the world was worth being in. I didn't know I was part of an experiment. I was just eating my lunch. A few of his classmates smiled at that. Mr. Okonkwo smiled at that. I thought for a long time about whether it bothered me, that he'd been watching, that he knew who my mum was before I told him, that the whole thing started as a kind of test. He paused again, the longer pause, the one he'd rehearsed. Here's what I decided. He wasn't testing me, he was testing himself. He was trying to find out if he could still trust people. And I happened to be there. And I happened to be someone he could trust. And because of that, he spent 1.5 years being the best friend I've ever had. And he left my mum something that took years off her face. And he left me something I wear on a cord around my neck. He touched the hearing aid. He did not explain it. He let it be what it was. Mr. Harlan told me that listening is a choice. Not hearing, that's just physics, but listening, deciding to turn towards something and receive it. He said he'd spent most of his life hearing very well and listening very badly, and that was his real loss, not the thing that was happening to his ears. He looked at the window for a moment, then back. I don't think he changed my direction. I think I was already going this way. But he showed me what it looked like when someone chose it on purpose, after a long time of not choosing it. He showed me what it looked like to decide, late, that the math of giving what you have to the person next to you was the right math. Not because it gets you something, just because the person is there and you have enough. He looked at his mother. She was looking at him. Her hands were still in her lap. Her face was still composed. But her eyes had the particular quality of someone looking at something they have been hoping for a long time and have now found and are allowing themselves briefly to stop looking for. You used to say the fountain knew something, Marcus said. I asked him what. He said he hadn't figured it out. But I think I know what it is now. It's just that it has to keep going, even when nobody's watching, especially then. He stepped back from the front of the room. The applause from his classmates was the normal kind, present, genuine, not performed. And Mr. Okonkwo clapped in the particular way of a teacher who has heard many presentations and knows when a student has said the real thing rather than the expected thing. Marcus walked back to his seat. He sat down. He looked at the window. On his neck, the hearing aid turned slightly in its cord, catching the light. After the presentations, when the room had rearranged itself into the casual configuration of parents and children and teachers, Delia found him by the window. She did not say anything at first. She stood beside him and looked out at the garden, which was in its late April mode, aggressive, green, operating on its own agenda. Then she said, "He would have liked that." Marcus thought about it. He would have told me I used too many words. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but was what her laugh looked like when she was trying not to make a scene. He would have, she said, and then he would have put it in his pocket. They stood there for a minute. Outside, a bird was doing something complicated in the garden hedge. Inside, Mr. Okonkwo was talking to another parent about something. Marcus reached up and touched the hearing aid on its cord. "Mum," he said. When you worked in the Harlan building, did you ever see him before?" She was quiet for a moment. "Once, very early. He came in before anyone else was there, and I was finishing the floors. He walked through without looking. People usually do." "Did he look?" She thought about this. "No, not then." Marcus nodded. "But he remembered," she said. "He told me that in one of the letters Gerald gave me. He said he remembered the humming. He said it made the building feel different." Marcus turned to look at her. She shrugged, with the slight self-consciousness of someone who has been observed doing something private. "I hum. It helps." "I know," Marcus said. "I grew up in the same house." She looked at him. He looked at her. And then something that had been sitting between them, not heavily but present. The specific weight of a year of changes neither of them had asked for, and both of them had survived, shifted slightly. The way weight shifts when two people have been carrying something together long enough to stop separately calculating their portion of it. She put her arm around his shoulders. He was almost as tall as her now, which he found interesting and she found disorienting in the way that all the small proofs of time were disorienting. He leaned into her for a moment, the brief, unself-conscious lean of a boy who had not yet decided it was a complicated thing to do. Outside, the bird finished whatever it was doing and flew off. Inside, the room went on being a room. I've told a great many stories about what money does and does not do. I've told them in different voices and with different endings and with varying degrees of faith in the endings I gave them. But here is what I believe, having sat with this one for as long as it takes to understand it. The billionaire did not save the boy. The boy did not save the billionaire. That framing is too clean, too arranged, too satisfying in the wrong way, like a fountain that has been plumbed and controlled and pointed at a specific aesthetic effect. What actually happened was simpler and stranger. A man who had stopped listening sat on a bench.
A boy who had always been listening sat down next to him, and for 18 months they practiced the thing together. The decision, repeated every Saturday, to turn toward each other and receive what was there rather than what was useful. It cost the man something real. It cost the boy something real. The costs do not cancel out. They remain, the way real things remain, available to be returned to, changed by, and occasionally grateful for. There is a house on Trad Street in Charleston where the herb garden is growing again. On the desk in the upstairs room that used to be empty, there is a composition notebook. On a cord of kitchen twine, there is a small white hearing aid that belongs to a boy who can hear perfectly well and wears it anyway. I do not know what the fountain knows. I have a theory. I think it knows that the point was never the arriving. The point was the keeping going. The point was the water, showing up every morning whether anyone was watching or not, doing the one thing it was made to do, which was move. If this story found something in you, some small, quiet thing you'd forgotten was there, I hope you'll carry it with you. And if you'd like to hear more like it, you know where to find us. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next one.